Hello, my name is Seth Arens. Today I'm going to talk with you about ecological succession and emerging tributaries to Glen Canyon. First, I'd like to orient you to the region. Glen Canyon is a canyon along the Colorado River that begins at the Colorado's confluence with the Dirty Devil River and ends at Lee's Ferry. This canyon was inundated after the construction of Glen Canyon Dam and the filling of Lake Powell beginning in 1963. However, long-term drought since about the year 2000 has dramatically lowered Lake Powell elevations, and many landscapes that were once under Lake Powell are now emergent terrestrial landscapes. I want to give you a little bit of an image of this. So the image on the left is an aerial photograph of Lake Powell at Bullfrog Bay and Halls Creek Bay. This is in 2011 when the reservoir was at an elevation of 3654 feet. Now full pool elevation when the reservoir is completely full is at 3700 feet. So this was already down below full pool, but pretty full. Now 11 years later in 2022, at this point in 2022, the reservoir had dropped to an elevation of 3539 feet. And you can see that Halls Creek Bay is nearly completely dewatered and Bullfrog Bay is significantly smaller. Right now, Lake Powell is at an elevation of 3520 feet. This is 180 feet below its full pool elevation. Now, this drop in water level over the last nearly 25 years, it's not caused by any one thing, but it's caused by a combination of how we use water in the Colorado River Basin, long-term drought, and climate change. That is, climate change acting to intensify drought, to make droughts longer and more severe. Now, as an ecologist, what I'm most interested in is not the water, but the land where water once was. So at Lake Powell's current elevation of 3520 feet above sea level, there is over 100,000 acres of land that was once inundated by Lake Powell, but is now a terrestrial ecosystem. Now, I've done some work in this region looking at what sorts of plants and ecosystems are establishing on landscapes once inundated by Powell beginning in 2019. And in 2019 through 2021, I was doing work in Cataract Canyon in 3 tributary canyons that were inundated by Lake Powell and examining what sorts of changes were occurring there. However, this last year in 2022, I expanded this work to Glen Canyon, the Lake Powell region as a whole. And I began a 4-year study. So the goal of this study is to assess what sorts of plants and ecosystems are reestablishing on these landscapes that were once inundated and how these landscapes are changing over time. So in the first 2 years of the study, I'll be establishing plant survey sites around the Glen Canyon region, in tributary canyons to Glen Canyon, and in some cases along the main stem of either the San Juan or Colorado rivers. And in years 3 and 4 of this study, I'll revisit these sites, resurvey them to understand how these systems are changing over time. In 2022, I established 40 plant survey sites in 9 tributary canyons or general locations like the Rincon. Now, to begin a discussion of what's happening in terms of ecological restoration in this region, I'd like to kind of take just a walking tour through pictures up 2 different tributary canyons. So all of the field work that I do in this region is accessing the mouth of tributary canyons by using motorboats going across Lake Powell, landing at the mouth of these tributary canyons, and then walking upstream, identifying sites, and ultimately surveying these sites. Now, because there are so many tributary canyons in Lake Powell, each individual tributary canyon is its unique experiment in primary ecological succession. All of the over 100 tributary canyons in the region are subject to the same disturbance at the same time. That is, Lake Powell rising and Lake Powell subsequently dropping and these landscapes drying. Now, I have a pretty close idea of the age of each of these landscapes because of detailed records of Lake Powell elevation and keeping track of those elevations as I'm out in the field. Now, Moki Canyon, which is near Bullfrog Bay, is really one of the best examples of native plant and ecosystem spontaneous restoration that I've seen in this region so far. The image on the left is part of Moki Canyon right after where we landed that has been uncovered for only about a week. And at this time, in May 2022, there had been no plants established yet. However, walking a bit upstream of there to a landscape that has been out of Lake Powell for about a year and a half, you can see that plants are reestablishing here. Actually seeing mostly native grasses and native shrubs like coyote willow and seep willow. As you walk upstream to above 3,600 feet and to landscapes that have been uncovered for 2 to 3 years or 5 to 11 years, the riparian corridors are dominated by coyote willow, and you're also seeing the presence of cottonwoods and Gooding's willow. In both of these systems, it's mostly native species that are present here. In some of the highest reaches of Moki Canyon, where restoration is occurring on landscapes that have been uncovered for 11 and 23 years, you can see the image on the left. There's a beaver dam. Beavers have recolonized many of these tributary streams. It's dominated by cattail, coyote willow, seep willow, and in both of these images you see taller cottonwoods. However, ecosystem restoration does not occur the same way in each of these tributary canyons. In Reflection Canyon, I saw much more coverage of non-native plant species. And in the image on the left, near the mouth, near lake level in Reflection Canyon, there were large areas that were nearly 100% covered with a non-native grass, awned barnyard grass. This is an invasive plant species from Asia. And this is in a landscape that was uncovered only for 1 year. Moving further up the canyon to a landscape that has been uncovered for 2 years. A lot of what you're seeing there is Russian thistle. However, there's also some coyote willow. You're also seeing there those dark tree trunks. Those are either gamble oak or cottonwoods that were growing before the initial inundation by Lake Powell, and the stems of these trees are still present. Now in this same area, a landscape uncovered for about 2 years, the image on the left is showing a location in the very, very early stages of a likely hanging garden system starting to grow. Moving a little further upstream to a landscape uncovered for about 3 years. What you're seeing in this image is nearly all native species, mostly seep willow and coyote willow. As you move further up Reflection Canyon, there's another hanging garden that has reestablished, this time in a landscape that has been uncovered for about 11 years. And you can see that there's robust growth of maidenhair fern, probably also some monkey flowers that are in there but not blooming at this time. However, there's also a non-native grass growing right next to it, Ravenna grass. The image on the right shows a landscape that has been uncovered for 21 years. While there's no cottonwoods at this location, these are all native shrub species, likely 2 species of baccharis and coyote willow. Now, I'd like to focus a little on one particular tributary canyon in the Escalante arm. I set up 5 plant survey sites in 50 Mile Canyon, which is a tributary to the Escalante arm or Escalante River. In 50 Mile Canyon, I established 2 sites above 3,700 feet. So this distinction between above and below 3,700 feet is important because it's making the distinction between landscapes that were never flooded by Lake Powell, those above 3,700 feet, and landscapes that were flooded by Lake Powell. These are sites below 3,700 feet. Also established 3 sites below 3,700 feet, and in general, I establish sites at specific target elevations. I'd find random sites around this target elevation, but I selected these 3 target elevations to represent landscapes of different ages, about 22 years old, uncovered, 5 years, and 1 to 2 years. This allows me to compare similarly aged landscapes between different tributary canyons. And this is a sample design that I replicated in several tributary canyons. So I want to give you a little bit of some of the summarized data. The data that I collected from plant survey sites consisted of plant cover data, and this was collected by randomly selecting a site to place a transect perpendicular to the tributary creek, and along that transect at 16 locations using a 1 by 1 meter quadrat, identifying the percent or estimating the percent cover of each plant species within that 1 by 1 meter quadrat. So in 50 Mile Canyon, above 3,700 feet, this is the group of bars on the left, there was much greater native plant species cover compared to non-native plant species cover. In fact, there were very few non-native plant species. Below 3,700 feet, there was a higher proportion of non-native plants. These were mainly Russian thistle and tamarisk. And overall, total plant cover was lower at sites below 3,700 feet compared to sites above 3,700 feet. Now, if I look at some percent plant cover data across all of the sites that I visited in 2022, this represents 40 sites, 14 above 3,700 feet, never impacted by Lake Powell, and 26 below 3,700 feet. This graph here shows percent cover, but plants are divided by functional group. So crust, cactus, forb, grass, shrub, tree, and then the bars all the way on the far side are total cover of plants. And above 3,700 feet, there was significantly greater plant cover, also greater cover of cactus, crust, and trees. Below 3,700 feet, there was overall lower cover of plants, more bare ground. However, there was a greater coverage of forb species, but no difference between perennial and annual forbs. I do want to point out that there is crust present in these areas. There is biological crust beginning to reestablish itself in locations that were once inundated by Lake Powell. Looking at plant coverage data from all 40 sites and dividing this into two categories, native and non-native plant species, and again, looking at plant coverage above 3,700 feet and below 3,700 feet, I find that there's no significant trend between native and non-native species. However, if you remove sites from the below 3,700 feet category, sites that were uncovered for more than 20 years, then there is a trend towards higher coverage of native plant species at sites above 3,700 feet. In general, the most abundant non-native plant species were tamarisk, Russian thistle, cheatgrass, awned barnyard grass, and Ravenna grass. Areas below 3,700 feet in the Glen Canyon region are experiencing spontaneous restoration of plants and ecosystems. In general, there's rapid colonization of plants in tributary canyons with perennially flowing water. In general, this rapid colonization occurs after 1 to 2 years. Overall, there's abundant native plant growth. Non-native plant species are present, but in general, native plant species are outcompeting non-native plant species. Younger landscapes typically have more non-native plant species present. However, native plants are generally dominant on older landscapes. By this I mean landscapes that are older than 2 to 3 years. Species assemblages vary between tributary canyons. In some tributary canyons, there's a very native assemblage of species. In other tributary canyons, there are many more non-native plant species present. Also, hanging gardens are reestablishing it in as little as 3 years, and in sites where hanging gardens have established for 11 to 22 years, these hanging gardens are well established and robust. And finally, I just want to bring up a few management implications of what's happening in terms of ecosystems reestablishing in these tributary canyons. And one of those is how to manage non-native plants. To my knowledge, there is not any active management of invasive or non-native plant species in these tributary canyons within Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. There are many common non-natives that in other places have become really big problems, like Russian thistle and tamarisk, that in general are not proliferating and establishing for long periods of time. In general, tamarisk in particular is being outcompeted by native shrub species, and most areas with large tamarisk stands are looking relatively unhealthy and drought stressed. I think there is some monitoring and research that's needed to understand how certain invasive or non-native plant species are, the coverage of these and how they're spreading. Species like Ravenna grass and awned barnyard grass, I'm really curious to see what the coverage of these plant species might be like in the future. And it could be useful to have some active management techniques to manage for certain invasive species. And the one example that I have of that is Russian olive. Russian olive is an invasive that's been a big problem in the Escalante River drainage. However, I didn't see it in very many locations in the Glen Canyon tributaries. However, there were a few individual Russian olive trees in two tributary canyons, Reflection and Forgotten Canyons. This could be a good place where active management removal of these Russian olives might be beneficial to the system. Another management concern that I am going to be first to admit that I do not know a lot about right now. I need to educate myself more about grazing, but that's potential implications of grazing in this region. Cattle grazing below 3,700 feet in these zones where ecosystems are reestablishing, the grazing could damage some of these restoring ecosystems. I did see signs of cattle, not extensive herbivory, but just some cattle dung in both Moki and Lake Canyons. Ultimately, I have more questions than answers in regards to grazing, and I know some of these questions are very answerable questions, but ones that I do not have an answer to yet. And this includes, how significant is the impact of grazing on these restoring ecosystems? Do grazing allotments extend below 3,700 feet? Which tributary canyons are accessible to cattle, and which grazing allotments are currently being used? Finally, I think there is a management implication of this work when it comes to larger scale management of water within the Colorado River Basin. By 2026, the Colorado River Interim Guidelines for Lower Basin Shortages and Coordinated Operations of Lakes Powell and Mead needs to be renegotiated. There need to be new guidelines in place by 2026. The Bureau of Reclamation and other stakeholders will begin work on this soon, I believe. I think that this research is important to be known for that process. There is now going to be a cost to refilling Lake Powell. Whether climate and water use allows Lake Powell to be filled or not is a completely different question. But if Lake Powell were to be filled, there is a cost to this. There will be a loss of ecological and cultural resources that have been reestablished in some cases for as long as nearly 25 years. Ecological resources below 3,700 feet in Glen Canyon should be considered in this process. I don't claim to think that this is the most important issue in Colorado River water management. It's not, but it's an issue that should be considered. One goal of my research is to provide information that's relevant to both land and water management. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge two organizations that have funded this research, the Glen Canyon Institute and Western Water Assessment. I'd also like to acknowledge Glen Canyon National Recreation Area's support and permitting of this research. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.